Okay. Welcome. 30 January. This and that. This and that information. Welcome. Uh, we're going to do even more. We're going to finish off time space or space time and value, what we were reading yesterday, Paul Clavel, and perhaps some other things. Um, I know it's taken a long time. It's a long article, well, longer article, and but it does represent some moderately current things. And I think that's still important to emphasize that some of the basic divisions that exist in Marxism or in left politics in general are kind of like that. For example, uh, non-Trumpist Republicans are derisively called rhinos, that is RINO, Republicans in name only. Similarly, uh, if Republicans believe that all Democrats are Marxists, it does raise an interesting kind of question, or communists, that is. And it is, what place is there for those among Democrats, those who are moderates or centrists or progressives? Um, that it is, on the one hand, labeling and name calling. On the other hand, it is quite current and interesting in the face of lots of strange things, which we will talk about after this. So there are some new words, of course, in the text that we've been reading. Substantialism, the doctrine that substantial reality is the basis for all phenomena, which we sort of assume that reality is composed of substance-oriented things. But on the other hand, where is there place for thought, as it were? Kind of that's the whole issue of Hegelianism and Marx and Hegelianism. The question of how much thought there is, how thought directs things, or is it a matter of collectivity or collective action? So deviationism is defined as a deviation from accepted beliefs or policies, especially from a prescribed form of communism. It does come up within the context of communism, Bolshevism, etc. Um, and it is refers to the kind of ideological deflection from the party line, particularly from Orthodox communism. And yes, there's lots of name calling that goes on, but it's really no different elsewhere, right? Whether you're a capitalist roader or whatever, or the difference between the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Anyway, uh, I've shown this before. This is the structure. There's a diagram for the structure of argument in Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, and we've been looking at Marx's Capital. We'll do that again this weekend with the next chapter in the New Princeton translation. But more specifically, and the point is brought up in the article about, why is it that Marx begins with a more abstract conception rather than starting off with money? Um, he starts off talking about, which on this diagram, the money is over here, right? You go 1, 2, 3, then to 4, 5, 6, and 7. So 6 and 7, that is if you look at this linearly, money's way over here. And so he begins with something that's a little bit more anthropological, and I won't go at great length through this, but I think you can see that the argument is built on a system of abstractions that define, a certain type of reality that shows how needs are defined, and they're defined collectively. They're not defined individually, and that there are some questions of what is equal, what is relative, what is absolute. All of those things are at work, and also property, of course, which isn't identified specifically in the diagram, but it's there. And then last time, as among many other early times, I showed you a comparison between two dichotomous ideas or dualisms or binaries, constant capital and variable capital, and fixed capital and circulating capital. So there are two pairs, and these pairs are differentiated along some important lines. And more specifically, I would assert space and time, or spatial and temporal issues. These are also epistemological categories for some people, that people sometimes you can define, people in space, right? As opposed to, like some politicians, it's the space is for them is between the ears. So anyway, we were reading through this, and let me read the abstract again, and then we can go skip to the place where we left off yesterday. Abstract is Marxist interpretations of the facts of spatial distribution are in fashion. Now, and this is written, a while ago, 1993. This may seem strange when the extent of geography's borrowings from Marx is in fact so limited. Marx does, however, show a keen awareness of the effects of division of labor and the accumulation of wealth on distribution of men, people, and activities. He underlines the importance of the opposition between town and country, proposes the exploration of the center-periphery relationship that is in economic development, and gives an indication of the interplay of manifestations of class consciousness in spatial distribution. References to space, which are common at the beginning of his work, become less and less so until book one of Das Kapital, volume one, which contains none at all. This may be explained by the fact that the analysis of the appearance of actual money can only be done in the abstract form, which Marx used by ignoring spatial consideration. That's the crux of the article, is the relationship between, concrete and abstract forms. And money is a very abstract form, but yet it has obviously concrete consequences. Contemporary Marxist thought is attempting to reintroduce space into a system which had eliminated it. This is being done by picking out from Marx's writings, number one, the elements of a positive theory of the facts of distribution and structure. Number two, by insisting on the analysis of praxis, which is the active integration of theory and practice. And number three, by developing the critical aspect of the Marxist process. While these three orientations lead to interesting results, they nevertheless remain ill-adapted to geographical consideration. And so we'll skip down. Well, let's see. I think we're not going to get there. Go all the way down. It's here somewhere. There's space and Marx's legacy. And I think I skipped past it. There it is. Space and Marx's legacy. Okay, so we should end at the normal time today. Space and Marx's legacy. That Marxist thought in the social sciences should thus have come to a standstill is no fortuitous occurrence. Yes, indeed. Provided that one is able to avoid all sorts of right-wing deviationisms linked with positivism, which make thought the vassal of a bourgeois conception of science, as well as left-wing deviationisms, which insist on all critical aspects and readily sacrifice scientific pretensions to a more critical type of philosophy. One remains inside a system in which remaining loyal at all costs to scientific orthodoxy makes it difficult to carry out free inquiries in the fields of history, geography, sociology, anthropology, or political science. Now, this does not, of course, prevent Marxist scholars from doing useful work, but their principles are most often of very little visible assistance. These principles usually lead them to selecting fields in which conflicts with orthodox thought are easily avoided. That is, you divert yourself into math, the craze for quantitative methods, for systemic analysis, or certain modes of structural analysis can be explained by this. In some fields, it's the linguistic turn, and in others, it is the mathematical turn. Anyway, what contribution can and does all this reflection bring to geography when it only stirs up Marxist themes again and again, recombining them, adding to them, grafting them upon the corresponding themes of Freudianism or linguistics? What can possibly be added to the knowledge of space by all those systems, which place the infirmity of human consciousness in the forefront and devote themselves to demonstrating the influence of the unconscious in all its forms? A lot more than was the case a few years ago, thanks to the new anxieties which have rejuvenated Marxist thought. Remember, this is 1993. Despite the limits imposed on it by the logic of capital, The contribution of Marxist thought to our knowledge of space is considerable. For a long time, it was limited by the naturalistic prejudice of most geographers. For one who in studying distribution hardly envisages any other influence than that of the physical environment, Marxism has a link to offer beyond a dialectical interpretation of the relations between man and nature. This in itself is far from negligible, as Soviet work on the science of landscapes proves, but it does not lead to an intimate understanding of the spatial configuration of societies. In order for this to be made perfectly clear, one has to go into the social and economic aspects of Marxist thought. Some attempts are being made to this end in three different directions: that of spatial theory, that of the analysis of spatial practices, and that of critical thought in relation to space. Number four, space and Marx's legacy. Number three, this is part of the third section of the article on contemporary developments in Marxist thought and space. Subsection one, the theoretical contribution of Marxism to the knowledge of space. A, Marxist geography is discovering the interest of theoretical reflection. In Eastern Bloc countries, they're seeking to put to use the theory of productive forces, territorial complexes after the manner of Alexandrov, Baransky, and Kolosovsky. In doing so, analysis of the division of labor is placed at the forefront of the principles of location, as in location, location, location. As long as it was a matter of understanding the organization of national space, the approach remained fairly simple. In the context of the large socialist space constituted by Comic-Con, it has nothing to do with comics or cosplay. Well, it could have something to do with cosplay. Anyway, the situation is quite different, and this stimulates reflection. Soviet geographers are thus rediscovering in Marx what Marx took from classical economists Smith or Ricardo. Paradoxically enough, they are embarrassed about using the rest of his theoretical apparatus, which describes a system dominated by class struggle. The division of labor, which should develop in a socialist world, is completely different. This undoubtedly remains the lack of boldness of Eastern Bloc theoreticians who can find no specific indications in Marx to guide them in their difficult attempt to find a new spatial order. Soviet geography today exercises a noticeable influence over Italian geography. Translations, particularly of Sauskin's work, have a lot to do with this. As much importance is attached to the study of the division of labor as in Eastern Bloc countries, but the whole structure has additional features which can only be applied to the analysis of capitalist countries. Class struggle has spatial aspects which should be clarified. Class consciousness develops more rapidly in certain atmospheres than in others. It often takes the form of tension between town and country, or between the industrialized regions of the North and the underdeveloped areas of the South. Young scholars, particularly in Turin, now remember this was talking about Italy, but in some ways it's you can apply it to America. Young scholars, particularly in Turin, are attempting to make the basic categories of Marxist analysis into a tool to be used systematically. They're insisting on the necessity for geographers to use the notions of surplus value, profit, and concentration. The logic of capitalism is that of accumulation. It's easy to exploit this theme by giving it a geographical dimension. The analysis of its externalities, to which the limit theory has attached more and more importance over the last generation, but pollution is an externality, for example, can be taken up from this perspective. The growth of big cities is explained in this way. Concentration also takes the form of the internationalization of capital with the emergence of multinational firms. Marxist theory obtains approximately the same result as liberal thinking, but does not make it clear why accumulation, after taking the form of geographical concentration of investments, today leads to their being dispersed throughout the developed world and part of the underdeveloped world. C. In order to give Marxist theory a spatial dimension, research has to be carried further. Italian geographers are doing this by insisting that space is a product of groups. In this, they agree with most of their French colleagues. The influence of Henri Lefebvre can be seen in both countries. Subsection 1, the theoretical contribution of Marxism to the knowledge of space. All geographers are prepared to admit that the space in which the life of a group is lived is the result of arrangements for which man is responsible. They agree to talk about production of space, but they do not include in this expression the idea of creation of space out of nothing. Man's environment, people's environment, gradually becomes more and more artificial, but the natural elements never disappear from it. Most Marxist geographers go further than this. In their opinion, there can be no space which has not been produced. No space perceived by humans, for example, which has not been produced in that, you cognize it, you perceive it, you exist in it. Their position is a logical one. It is the only one which is compatible with their orthodoxy. If space is produced, one cannot, in fact, understand it except if considered from its starting point. That is society. That is, organization of groups in society do this. Any interpretation of the spatial configuration of societies is therefore implicitly contained in the genesis of the commodities form and the money form, according to the fundamental scheme of Book 1 of Capital. And I showed you that diagram before. Space is thus not a fundamental category of the theory, but modern Marxist thought manages to apprehend it in two ways. In some cases, space is obviously a commodity to which one can apply everything has said about production, of the tendency towards concentration, of the influence of entrepreneurs in determining demand. The subject of towns is one to which Marxist thought finds itself particularly relevant. Until the Second World War, construction in most industrial countries remained a comparatively backward sector, very close in its structures to the small-scale industry of former times, carpenters, etc. Over the past 20 years, industrialization has made decisive progress. On the European continent, construction of housing is more and more frequently on a large scale. In English-speaking countries, this has been so for so much longer, although the concentration of building has not at all taken the same form as in France or Italy. And that has to do with a bunch of other things that best left for a city planning course, I suppose. Marxist geography and sociology, Manuel Castells, for example, has done more than most geographers to bring some new life into this field. And he talks about it in the kind of idea of capital flows, which sort of actually coheres to a Keynesian argument or post-Keynesian argument. Anyway, in the English-speaking world, David Harvey has encouraged geographers' initiatives emphasize Marxist geography and sociology emphasize the conditions in which space produced in the large towns of the modern world bear more and more visibly the marks of advanced capitalism. They insist on the role of monopolistic forces, on the collusion between private and public interests, and the intervention of state capitalism. A study of advertising leads them to underlining the fact that demand is conditioned by supply. Some have tried to go further. In Marx and in Engels, there is a reflection on land rent and its role in capitalism. Specialists in the value of land are trying to bring this analysis up to date. They have now introduced in sociology and economics in the French-speaking world the concept of an absolute rent, which is supposed to constitute one of the forms of exploitation linked to monopolies in advanced industrial societies. But in all serious research work, the same idea is to be found that this is an exceptional situation connected with particular historical circumstances. For example, if you're going to apply, Marxist land rent theory to India, for example, it's going to take a slightly different configuration. Anyway, the Marxist analysis of land markets Marxist analysis of land markets finds it useful to the understanding of segregation and of contrast in the social geography of big cities. It has not led, in spite of what some of its promoters contend, to the discovery of mechanism hitherto unknown to liberal economists. Section E, there is another way of approaching space while remaining faithful to the basic Marxist system, which originally eliminates it. The system which originally eliminates it. As early as the German ideology, Marx described the exploitation of neighboring countries by those nations which are becoming industrialized, but this idea underwent changes. It's very much in favor at the turn of the century when J. A. Hobson's book on imperialism made imperialism fashionable. Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin took an interest in the theme. After this, it ceased to be studied for 30 years or so. Since 1955 to 1960, it has been central to the interpretations Marx has put forward when they're considering the reasons for inequality of development. And remember, this is a native French speaker's writes this. The simplest interpretation of the world's present situation consists in seeing it from a geographical point of view in terms of a division into rich and poor nations, which could be a form on the worldwide scale of the struggle between classes, the latter now being constituted of countries. The center versus periphery pattern could then explain the present evolution. It is not, however, completely satisfactory because it does not say what creates the center and the periphery. Good Marxist theoreticians are responsive to this criticism. They also mistrust an interpretation which places a considerable share of responsibility for unequal development on the shoulders of the working classes in developed countries. The criticisms addressed to A. Emmanuel's book about unequal exchange are evidence of this. Present ideas about underdevelopment are more subtle, but in common with those just mentioned, they introduce space in the form of a group of areas differentiated by their levels of development. The development of underdevelopment theory is only indirectly a spatial one. It is basically a historical pattern, that of the coexistence of formations of different ages. Space only exists because it is marked by different times. It is apprehended solely through its socioeconomic content, and the roles of distance and natural characteristics are ignored. The theory of the development of underdevelopment can take two symmetrical forms. For Andre Gunder Frank, A.G. Frank, the emphasis is on overproduction inherent in the capitalist system, which can only protect itself against crisis by exporting capital and goods. The genesis of underdevelopment is thus linked to the circulation of surplus values, a very standard Marxian approach of about overproduction. Number two, for such authors such as Clow, the emphasis is placed rather on the direct pursuit of a high surplus value through overexploitation of the natural and human resources of the third world. So you can see that there's two slightly different versions of the same thing, which can exist at the same time. You can overexploit and overproduce at the same time. The two theories are not, as I said, in any case, mutually exclusive. Recent work often combines them. The development of underdevelopment in peripheral areas, whether they be the deprived areas of large states or poor countries, expresses both the desire on the part of the center to secure new markets so as not to suffer from overproduction, and its anxiety to maintain high profits by creating modernized enclaves in peripheral areas where population pressure keeps salaries down. You can even see that in the difference between, for example, red and blue states in the United States. It is the case of the old industrial parts of England or of Western, Central, or Southern France. The analysis is extended to the study of the state's new roles. That is, its social and cultural integration policy favors the development in depressed areas of habits of consumption essential to the control of tendencies to overproduction. Section F. Many geographers, sociologists, and economists of a Marxist turn of mind, when reflecting on the question of space, take a more qualified view. They talk about the production of space and make use of this idea to explain, for example, the congestion of big cities in the modern world. But they recognize that social space is made up, in most societies, of elements only slightly transformed by man, by people. Space for them can no longer be reduced to the restrictive structures of Book One of Capital. Such is the position of Henri Lefebvre, the French sociologist who writes for 40 years or so on urban society. Many scholars are studying the relative effect of different forces. They do not deny the overriding influence of infrastructures, but they are interested in superstructures. That is, they look for social or political interpretations. That is, the legal structure is really important because it is part of the superstructure. The ideas of Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas are making headway. The major features of contemporary society are explained by the emergence of new productive forces. Shigeto Suru, for example, underlines that scientific research has now become one of those superstructural forces. This introduces new tendencies toward geographical concentration, Silicon Valley. Those arising from the search for externalities linked with facilities offered for innovation, right? Route 128 and Silicon Valley, and to their internalization by the most powerful companies. Marxist geographers and sociologists have not exploited it directly, but it is this theme which guided Jean Remy in developing his theory of urban advantage on the same line of comparative advantage, etc. The opening up of contemporary Marxism can also be seen in other directions. There's a close resemblance between Marx's political economy, Freud's psychoanalysis, and Saussure's linguistics. They all rest upon the discovery of discontinuities in individual or collective reality and are consequently disciplines which unveil the truth. They're built on opposing pairs, that is, consciousness, ideology, conscious and unconscious, and language and speech. And all those are different, no different than weather and climate. At the level of those realities which cannot be reached by common analysis, the structural approach proves to be indispensable. Would it not be possible thus to develop a spatial semiology? That's the only time that word is mentioned in this article, but it is a reference to an entire body of French thought. And semiology is not necessarily identical to semiotics, and that's a whole another story. A science of the environment which would give a new impetus to the study of perception and the social dimension it generally lacks. Are there not, in the geography fashioned by man, regularities which have to do with the unconscious laws of the working of the mind? The study of spatial configurations could have much to gain from this kind of concern. Section G. However interesting the research carried out by Marxist theoreticians, we must needs acknowledge that space is never considered for its own sake. Extension in space, distance, natural conditions hardly count in the approaches we've just been surveying. They are more explicit in the work of certain geographers with liberal-inspired theories, such as William Bunge, and I think it's Bunge, not Bunge, in the 60s, or David Harvey in his more recent work. They obviously make the most of all that divisions of labor and class struggle has to offer, but they do not forget more classical spatial preoccupations. Among the forms of exploitation, Bunge and Harvey have emphasized those which result from inequality of access to resources and equipment. And in doing so, they have given Marxist-inspired geography a revolutionary impact it had long lost. Recall yesterday that was mainly discussing how Soviet geology had developed, and geography had developed. Soviet geography, had a problematic history, no different than, for example, Soviet psychology. But anyway, that's another story. Bunge's investigations in Detroit and other American cities bring out these inequalities and emphasize their theoretical issues. In their most recent work, J.M. Blount, David Harvey, and other Marxists have tried to extract from the Grundrisse a more systematic spatial theory than hitherto suggested. That is why Harvey has spent more time on the Grundrisse. It is early days yet to judge the coherence of what they're constructing. Number two, Marxism and spatial practices. Scientific Marxism, until the Second World War, tended to be confused with the then dominant positivist or scientist tendencies. These days, it sometimes becomes structuralist. In both cases, the risk is that by devoting itself too exclusively to theory, it may neglect practice and cut itself off from the real sources of comprehension of the social world. Many young Marxists are therefore trying to lead geography in another direction. They're making it into an analysis of the spatial dimensions of praxis. Their approach is somewhat similar to that of the sociology of action, but theirs is a different inspiration. Many Soviet geographers are devoting themselves to retracing the stages of progressive control of the environment. They bring out the tactics of conquest and organization of space. The voluntary geography brought into play by planning authorities is taken to be a strategy, city and regional planning authorities. Baranski already described the development of Siberia as a series of offensives proceeding from one industrial base to the next. Soviet geography owes its epic quality to this preoccupation with the analysis of praxis. It is always the narration of a prodigious adventure, that of groups which, by wresting its riches from nature little by little, become united in the struggle and find in it their dignity and grandeur. Those descriptions help to see what the system is tending towards. That is, the desire to attain communism as soon as possible provides the impetus towards the accumulation of capital, the choice of giant installations, the pursuit of large scale achievements, which is the sign of a transition to the material universalism, which opens the way to the final universalization of values and attitudes. One feels in the operations described an anxiety to eliminate the disparity between town and country and to establish spatial justice by offering the same opportunities. The feeble analysis of practices as presented by Eastern Bloc geographers is due to the absence of critical attitude. They're usually satisfied with a catalog of intentions and a list of planning objectives, and they neglect the subtle dialectic of action and the resistance of the natural and social environment. Section B, connections conditions in the liberal economies are certainly better for a Marxist wishing to analyze praxis. That Marxist is not obliged to give a privileged place to collective action as structured by planning authorities. They can go into the complexities of perception, the multiplicity of projects, the diversity of strategies. Not all components of the population have the same mental equipment, the same horizon, the same ability to grasp space, to place it in it, productive combinations, to ascribe a military value to it. The origins of inequalities between groups often lie here. The analysis of the spatial components of praxis add a new dimension to the study of class struggle. Number two, Marxism and spatial practices. Among the groups with conflicting interests, one deserves particular attention. The strata which are lowest on the social scale carry on struggles which are often looked down on by researchers, but which herald tomorrow's revolutions. The Marxist intellectual shows his genuine humility by devoting himself to casting light upon working class upheavals and their coordination. For some 15 years, urban movements have been central to much research work. Their significance was discovered at about the same time in North American ghettos, in the immigrant workers' districts of large West European cities, and in the favelas, barrios, and shantytowns of the Third World. In a somewhat different style, Lacoste is trying to grasp the logic of revolutionary strategies in their military manifestations. He is thereby sharing the preoccupations of traditional military geography. He's discovered Clausewitz, but only to use him as a tool to crush capitalism with, indeed. For him, the type of praxis which ought to be clarified is that of the guerrilla, who succeeds in standing up to regular forces in a struggle for liberation. See, Che Guevara. On another scale, it is most important to analyze the strategy of Diop, that is Marshal Diop, the leader of the North Vietnamese military. The way he uses nature and society to resist enemies with infinitely greater facilities at their disposal. Number three, Marxism as critical thought and space. The third direction taken by Marxist thinking on space is that of criticism. It is perhaps this which leads to the profoundest challenges to traditional geographic approaches. Subsection A. At the beginning of the 19th century, Marx rebelled against the excessive use that was made of the lessons of 18th century rational philosophy. The principles of natural law and of competition were being used to justify the most doubtful practices of the bourgeois order and of capitalism. His criticism denounced the ideological aspects of the social science of his time. By analyzing social regularities as if they were universal and immutable laws, it gave support to the most glaring injustices. Society in the second half of the 20th century is very different from the one in which Marx carried out his struggle. Capitalism has been transformed. The role of the state has grown continually. The most shocking inequalities have been reduced. In welfare economies, redistribution measures tend to even out the opportunities available to all. 15 or so years ago, the successes of liberal society seemed so great that people thought they could glimpse the end of the era of ill will and of ideologies. There are books on the end of ideology, etc. The social sciences had no hesitation in giving their support to the liberal order. There were some Marxists who had reservations. In France, Pierre Georges justified his critical attitude with respect to applied geography by his fear that geography would compromise itself on the pretext of development in doubtful tasks carried out to the benefit of private interests or the monopolist state. Gee, he asked geographers to be on their guard. This was the meaning of his quote unquote active geography. During the 1960s, the weaknesses of advanced liberal society became more and more noticeable. Vietnam, the discovery following Michael Harrington of the other America, poor America, and then that of the other world, the world of those excluded from the system on the periphery of the industrial world, have given rise to a new critical awareness. Michael Harrington being a socialist. Everywhere, people sought to measure the inequalities, the injustices, and imperfections of the existing social order. Number three, Marxism as critical thought in space. Part of the movement was led by radicals who did not come under the Marxist umbrella. Until 1970-72, most English-speaking geographers were still liberals. In the past few years, critical geography has become more and more a Marxist geography. It now devotes itself to demonstrating the various spatial forms of exploitation. David Harvey's work is very representative of this trend. In France, critical awareness has developed faster among sociologists and town planners than among geographers. Economists have recently started to be receptive to the movement when Herodote we can see the beginnings of a new feeling of anxiety among French academic geographers. Section B, thought is not fulfilling its critical function properly if it only denounces the flaws and imperfections of the social system. After all, it is ordinary citizens, laborers, peasants, workers of all kinds, and users of public services who are in the best position to assess the defects of the system they live in. Ineffectual chit-chat is often all that is needed to trigger off the spontaneous reactions of the masses. See social media. The critical consciousness has a more important function to fulfill. It should expose what, in the intellectual process, serves to hide the weight of private interests beneath apparent rigor. The Frankfurt School has played a fundamental role in the contemporary revival of this aspect of Marxism. From Marcuse and Horkheimer to Habermas, there has been some fundamental thinking on the subject of the betrayals of reason, which scholars in the social science cannot ignore. In this area, the contribution of geographers is considerable. This is most obvious among English-speaking scholars who stand on the outer fringes of Marxist thought, borrowing certain themes and inspirations from it without accepting all of its propositions. The recent work of Gunnar Olsson is symptomatic of this current. He studies the logics of theory and of practice. Actually, it's pretty wacky when you read his writings. Attempts at scientific formalization have now been devoted exclusively to clarifying the logical reasoning, which implies the theory, Galilean reasoning, as Olsson calls it. An equally rigorous formalization can be made of the intentional modes of reasoning, which are characteristic of praxis, those of Aristotelian logic, according to Olsson. In this domain, von Wright's work has opened the way. Starting from these premises, Olsson demonstrates the presuppositions implicit in planning actions. He learns to judge them not merely according to their technical efficiency, but according to their axiological content. In other words, there's certain axiomatic rule-making that's part of it. He attacks in particular the abuse of Pareto's criterion, which results in maintaining situations of inequality that could otherwise be eliminated easily. The Pareto optimality is of that type, where you sort of hold one thing constant, do something else, and blah, 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 blah. And that kind of logic, while interesting at a conceptual level or in a theoretical level, does not actually work well in practice. David Smith, in a neighboring sector, is seeking to construct a geography of welfare on the basis of criteria of choice, which are socially more satisfactory than those adopted hitherto. Now, finally, to the conclusion. Marxism's contribution to the reflection on space seems full of paradoxes and contradictions. The understanding of spatial reality one finds in Marx's publications, especially the earlier ones, reflects a breadth of vision which most of his contemporaries lacked, particularly those who were then laying the foundations of human geography. Marx had understood that it was impossible to comprehend the facts of distribution unless one addressed oneself to social groups as a whole, interacting with one another within a system. He emphasized the role of the technical level and the decisive importance of productive forces in spatial architecture. He also drew attention to the weight of social relations and was perfectly aware that within a mode of production, the political, the cultural, and the religious must not be disregarded if one wishes to understand the dynamics of the system and the way in which its members experience and transform it. Marx himself, from this potentiality, or from this potentially very modern idea of geography, did not fulfill all the promises of such works as the German ideology. There is, it seems to me, one fundamental reason for this. In order to transform the philosophical system he had already constructed by about 1845 into a doctrine free from the uncertainties of ideology, Marx needed to give it a scientific form. He managed to do so by presenting an original analysis of the formation and functioning of capitalism. By reshaping classical thinking about labor value, he extracted from it a general outline of the mechanisms of exploitation which justified the whole of his previous philosophical positions. But he only succeeded in doing so by manipulating, i.e., abstracting concepts, hence the logic of Capital, of the Capital Volume 1, thus reintroducing the kind of essentialist thought from which he claimed to have freed himself and which forced him to obfuscate some of the really significant concrete determinations behind the theoretical formulation of his demonstration. Space was thus eliminated from the final construction, except in the form of a product of society. Its properties are all deducible from the logic underlying the evolution of modes of production. It can have nothing unpredictable to offer. Section B, Marxist geography was from then onwards trapped in a major contradiction. Either remain faithful to the contours of the world and endeavored to account for all of its combinations and regularities and consequently modeled itself on Marx's earlier intuitions and approaches, or else it tried to be orthodox and ceased to be an objective approach. It was then nothing more than a spectacular exercise aimed at proving that the central theoretical structure of Book One of Capital is always right, whatever the circumstances. If the former position was chosen, the scholar took the positive or the critical path according to his own preferences and deepest motivations. If the latter position was adopted, his room for maneuver was drastically reduced. Was there anything left for him to discover? It seems not. And in any case, nothing on the plane of fundamental theory. The only way for the scholar's role to become autonomous would have been if his purpose had been to elucidate the relations between theory and praxis, and to establish a spatial theoretical practice of which Marx's writings only provide outlines. This was the way chosen by many geographers in Eastern Europe and by some Marxists in the West during the Stalinist era. This approach is not without dangers, however. Instead of concerning themselves with the real aspects of practice, they found it more elegant to look for the prospective states those practices would not fail to generate. The geography of practice, like all apologetics, thus became a curious collective hagiography. We were no longer being told about the life of an individual hero, but about that of the major collective figure, that is, reason embodied in the plan. Even Hegel had gone no further in his identification of reason with the state. All in those areas which Marxism has not yet conquered, prospects for research into praxis are infinitely more varied. They range from the study of peasant or urban movements to the analysis of revolutionary strategies. This has been the direction taken by many left-wingers in Europe and Latin America. Here, the geographer can find a lot to engage his curiosity, since in the development, his studying not everything was implicitly contained in the initial situation. His position is still an uncomfortable one, however. In revolutionary action, the pure intellectual is rather he who comments on the event after it has taken place than he who indicates in advance the course to take. To take the orthodox communist viewpoint, definition of revolutionary practice is the task of those who embody the class policy to follow in the decision-making bodies of the democratically centralized party, democratic centralism. When a more open Marxist philosophy is adopted, the position of the intellectual is hardly better. The one who can define the right political line, the one who has the right to define the practice, is the proletarian combatant, or possibly one who renounces speculation to devote himself to militant revolutionary action, as Che Guevara did. For one who lacks either the opportunity or the courage to throw him or herself into this kind of action, all that remains is to recount the practice of others. And we're back to hagiography once more. Section C, criticism is a more ambitious choice, takes up those parts of Marxist reasoning which give it coherence and originality. It aims at applying the principles of negative thought to new situations far more than at adding the final touch to scientific construction in the almost completed form capital has given it. The purpose is to rediscover the hidden principles which fashion the existing social order and are responsible for maintaining iniquitous situations. The critical method is very rarely practiced in Eastern Bloc countries. It has been developing rapidly in the West over the past 50 years or so, which accounts for the renewal of interest in the Marxist approach. From a geographical point of view, it has had appreciable results. Scholars are now aware of the ethical implications of facts of location. They refrain from invoking the neutrality of the scientific approach as a way of eschewing the problems of social justice. D, the critical method, however, is only one phase of research. One must, after laying bare the negative aspects of the situation, be able to put forward a more coherent new construction. A return to theoretical thinking has become necessary. The productions which have proliferated over the last 50 years or so have been extremely varied inspiration, but they have one thing in common. They never start by thinking directly about space. They never formulate a genuine spatial theory. The fundamental structure of the Marxist system prevents this, as we have seen. What is fascinating about the contemporary renewal of Marxist thought is how a system which cannot focus its quest on spatial problems ends up producing a spatial theory. It is not, however, a construction focusing on a single theme. Space only emerges as a subject in itself for those who study the division of labor. Outside the Eastern Bloc, there are relatively few in numbers. Distance and natural factors hardly count. What the theory apprehends is A, the production of space as a commodity, as part of the analysis of cities and the housing issue, and B, the difference in levels of development between societies. In the climate of the 19th century, it would have been unthinkable to put forward an explanation of the facts of distribution which did not include transport costs as a prominent factor. These are only integrated with difficulty by Marxism, although, as we have seen, one can, to some extent, use the indications given in Grundrisse in this connection. In the climate of the late 20th century, transport charges are of a less determining nature. The liberal theory no longer allows them to be more than one factor of location among others. Contemporary Marxist thinking about space should not therefore be condemned for hardly taking into account the factor of distance. What seems more serious, however, is that it often ignores the role of transparency, which is central to most other theoretical work. It is this deficiency which best exposes the limitation of the theoretical revival of the last few years and explains why research into praxis is so interesting, as it is the only one to consider these aspects. Section E. There can be no doubt that the predominant preoccupations of contemporary geography owe a lot to Marxism. Without it, the pursuit of spatial equity and the concern to define a juster, a more just order would not have imposed themselves so rapidly. Nevertheless, one gains the impression that it is in the external spheres of Marxist thought that the revival has been most remarkable. For those who are not ashamed of using all existing methods, the seed of Marxist critique has undoubtedly opened up a wider field of study. As soon as one gets nearer the orthodox core, however, limitations grow more pronounced and in the end far outweigh the advantages which accrue from revision of the values conveyed by bourgeois institutions. It is difficult to construct a science of space within a system whose logic eliminates space. Now, note, of course, let me break there just as we're about to end. This is what David Harvey talks about the annihilation of space. Anyway, recent advances have shown that it is possible, even in an unfavorable intellectual environment, sometimes to come up with new and correct interpretations. They also indicate that without a painful revision of its methodological presuppositions, Marxism will long remain unable to propose any satisfactory restructuring of our field of study. So anyway, that's here we go. So 2 decades of geographical space. The the French version by Paul Clavel. Thank you for bearing with me on this 2-day reading version of it, but I would assert that this at least identifies a broad range and scope uh, of of how both Western and Eastern Bloc geography is sort of occurred. I mean, it doesn't, even approach the problems that exist in Western geography, notably, starting with French and British geographers and a whole bunch of other craziness. That's a whole nother story. But it is interesting to see, how French geography kind of sees the world, at least in the 1990s, and identifies some things that are still at work. Why we still look at David Harvey, because he's not always talking about space, but it does condition or underlie many of his works, his research program, as it were. And I think it raises some important questions about how we should approach reading marks in the future. And I would hope that we would apply that, despite the fact that space has been erased or annihilated from the readings of Capital, and sort of insists on us reading um, uh, Marx's works written before Capital Volume 1. So I hope that people can see that, you don't just read one text. It's a multiplicity of texts. It has complex interpretations, and as I've tried to show in a couple of other writings, but this one is actually quite useful in terms of working on some core questions. That is, for example, um, looking at how Marxism still needs to have the kind of criticisms of a variety of parallel developments. That is, Joan Robinson and Maurice Dobbs, or even Paul Samuelson's comments on it, however reactionary, are actually kind of important to be seen all in the same body of literature. It's still a vital area to research. Okay, so that's that. Now, at the end, I, of course, threw in my little table again. But also, I added on, and I've already shown this before, so we don't have to watch it. But because Rancière, Jacques Rancière, who critiques Louis Althusser, as mentioned above in the above thing that we read today, is actually kind of important in the sense that he opposes the kind of theoretical thing that Althusser was doing with the whole question. I mean, he studies under Althusser, but his subsequent work has been to work on Marxism from below. That is, revolutionary activity, and that's kind of important to always resist that. And um, and Peter Solerdijk has of Sloterdijk has written really good stuff on the problem of false consciousness, and etc. Anyway, there's a movie. It's available in video on YouTube. It's an hour long or 52 minutes long or whatever it is. Um, but I think I've shown it before, so no, we don't need to watch it again. It's a 52-minute production, so we don't have to watch it now. You can watch it at your leisure. And so I will stop now. Let's see what the questions are. Dragons, pigs. It's the year of the snake, folks. Um, and it's not even going to be, my year coming up at all, not for a couple more years. So that's, you know, whatever. So I'll wish you a happy new year anyway, even though at Michigan State University, and I find it more conspicuous that the College of Communication Arts and Sciences decided that they would cancel the Lunar New Year celebrations because of DEI. And I find that, I just don't think that they should capitulate. And in fact, probably no one would notice that they were doing a Lunar New Year celebration in a subunit of the university. But they proceeded to capitulate to some imaginary Trumpism. On the other hand, it's Michigan State, whatever. So anyway, with that little closing comment, Joe, you can cut off the live stream unless there are brickbats
I know,
intervention.
I know.
Oh,
Don't you know DEI makes planes fall out of the sky?
That's right. It, it's all those black air traffic controllers that did this, right?
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
though, um, 74 or 80% of all American air traffic controllers are white men.
The
Um,
severely disabled. The severely disabled.
it's just,
You blame
um,
them as well.
it's just insane.
Easy.
Well, the presser was actually more interesting because he said, "Well, I own some helicopters," and then he proceeds to talk about how helicopters go up and down.
Yeah, it's like
I
I was
want the
thinking
Democrats to hop on that sucker.
yeah, it was like someone who's been driven a chauffeur all his life, thinking he's a mechanic, basically. You know,
It's just, I,
just have a clue what he's talking
I
about.
mean, eventually the press actually asked him some more pointed questions, but it just, what a bunch of, as one commenter said, wimps.
Yeah,
It's just the press corps. I just, cowardice at work. But of course, if Daily Caller, which was unlike, they managed to keep them out of the first Trump administration. Now they're there. Now you have right wing media outlets running around. Similarly to the attempt to put Sputnik in the Trump press corps, which was just totally weird. But I assume Russia Today has a RT has a person on the. Well, anyway, Joe, you can cut off the live stream before we start fomenting sedition or something.
cause an international